So at the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment, for the last 4 years, we've been working on a project called No Single Ingredient. And where we've been trying to understand not just was the one thing that leads to effective teaching, but what's the relationship between higher education, work environments, and the support for ongoing professional development, coaching and mentoring and those kind of things. And we have 3 projects going on in each area. Today I'm going to talk about the higher ed work. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing around the adult learning environment or the workplace itself. In some ways, and we've been doing a lot of this work with Sharon Ryan at Rutgers, and in some ways what I'm going to talk about today is blowing up the category of early childhood related higher education, because the concept, which we use in a lot of our research, actually doesn't tell us very much, because some of the programs that we say are early childhood actually don't ever focus on children younger than 5. And sometimes we think they're teacher education programs and there's actually no pedagogy. There's no focus on actually teaching practice in the program. So, and then we have sort of a suggestion about how to learn a little bit more about what we actually are doing around early childhood. So we did a study, I guess a year ago it came out by Default or Design, and I'm just going to, what did John say, water ski over it. I'm a Californian, I've never been on water skis, but doing it right now. So what we did in that study was we looked at 2 BA completion programs that people in Head Start were attending in the San Francisco Bay Area, 2 universities. They were upper division programs that people were considered early childhood related, and they were approved as the programs people should do because they were going to be teaching young children to get their BAs. And when we went to look at those programs, we relied on some of the methodology we had been used before to learn about early childhood teacher ed and studies I'd done and different people in this room have done. And what we were trying to really get a handle at, what do we really know about these programs? So the 2, there we go. So the 2 programs we looked at, and you can just see them up there. One was a program in child and adolescent development, and another one was in human development, but it had a teacher education minor. And so we interviewed people who were running those programs, we did student surveys about the programs, and we looked at as much documentation as we could. And you can read the paper to see exactly what we found out, but the upshot was that Program A was the program that actually had no courses dedicated to children younger than 5. They would topics would be taught, along the way. There was no, the only thing they had dedicated to children younger than 5 was a practicum that was 10 weeks long where people went in to observe one single child. There was literally no focus on teaching. And there was a lot of good stuff about child development, and students felt like they learned a lot, but there wasn't much content that was really early childhood focused. And then in the other one, Program B, they actually realized they had no early childhood focus, so they created a course in social emotional development and cognitive development and the human development side, and put together a teacher education minor that was focused on early childhood. But after the first cohort of students went through it, there was a funding crisis, as you may all remember, in 2008, and that was cut. So that was the end of that. And then for those folks going forward, the next cohorts of students, they actually got nothing applied in their program. So that made us think, gee, there has to be sort of a better way. And one of the things we were really concerned about was, how do we find out about the age level? We also wanted to find out more about clinical practice, what clinical experiences. We wanted to find out also more about the faculty, because in most of the methodology that had been used before, except maybe one study that Mary Lou did, we've been asking one person in an institution to tell us about the faculty, and actually they didn't know that much about the faculty. If you said they had experience teaching young children, they go, oh, that's interesting, I don't know. So that led us to think that we needed something new. So we developed the higher ed inventory, and what that does is we've designed it for states to use, particularly in terms of with their ELACs, or when they were trying to look at their whole professional development system, to really look at what the content, what the clinical experience was like, some things about the faculty and things about the institution. And it's described in your packet, so I won't go through that in great detail, but it has 3 modules. And the first one is the mapping module, and in most states, actually trying to figure out where the early childhood programs are in institutions is quite challenging, because some states they make sense because they're in education, but in a lot of states they're in education, they're in child development, they can be in liberal studies, they can be in consumer studies, they can be all over the map, and many institutions have multiple early childhood programs in different departments, and they don't talk to each other in the department. So the first thing is to just figure out where they are, then to find out what degrees are offered, what kind of certificates are offered, and to find out a little bit about the student population. Were they serving people who were sort of pre-service college students or traditional college students or non-traditional college students? And then we were trying to figure out who is the person in the program that you can actually ask about the program, because a lot of the times when you get to someone who's the department chair, they can't actually tell you anything about the early childhood program. So the mapping module is really just, in some ways, allows you to sort of set up your sample, but it's important to get the lay of the land. And then we have a program module where we dig in more about what the program content is, but looking at it for every topic that we talk about will be for age groups. So is it for kids, you know, infants and toddlers, preschoolers, and K through 3. And also we looked at things around clinical experiences, just what types of experience. A lot in the early childhood literature, we sort of conflate practicum and student teaching, and they're actually two very different things. Student teaching is where someone's really immersed in a classroom over time for maybe several months, taking more and more responsibility for curriculum and classroom management. And practicum is usually a clinical applied experience that happens in relationship to a course and has a very narrow focus, maybe on a particular population of children or on a particular domain of learning, but that we kind of talk about them being one and the same, and they often aren't. And we were also particularly interested, because we do so much work with non-traditional students, as to whether or not any of these clinically based experiences were adapted to be different for people who had been teaching for many years as opposed to people who were new to it, because it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks. And then we wanted to learn more about the institution and what kind of supports there were and whether or not they offered supports for non-traditional students. So that's in the program module. And then this is kind of an example where this is just one sample question where we would ask if these different topics were required, but we would also ask for if they were required for each of the different age groups. And then we have a faculty module where we were trying to dig deeper into who are the faculty who are teaching these different courses. Like, what is their background? What's their preparation? Have they taught young children? What additional knowledge do they need? And then some things about their demographic characteristics. And so we would, again, take some of the topics where we were asking about, this one's about child development and learning, whether or not they could teach these topics for children of these different ages, and whether or not they taught them in the last number of years, 2 years, I guess. And then we asked some questions about the roles people have been working on over the last 10 years. We had a vigorous debate about what was the cutoff. Like, you know, if you taught 30 years ago, did that count for you to be sort of relevant to teaching? Or if you taught, 2 years ago? And anyway, so it was an interesting conversation. We ended up at 10 years. So what we've done with the early childhood higher ed inventory, we've piloted in New Jersey. I'm going to give you a couple highlights from the New Jersey study. We're just finishing our analysis of Rhode Island. We're in the field in New Hampshire, and our human subjects, willing at Berkeley, will be in the field in California next week, and we're in conversation with New York about it. And so besides, we're doing the same inventory in all the states, but each state is allowed to design a couple of state-specific questions. So, like Rhode Island wanted to know whether or not the institutions, there were 5 of them, we have like 200 in California, had made any realignment of their course offerings with their early childhood teacher-educator competencies. In California, they wanted to know, well, actually, California is interesting because everybody that we're doing it through the ELAC, except in California, because we don't have an ELAC because of our governor. And so, well, I guess we have something, but it doesn't meet very often. But so we have foundation funding, and so one focus is going to be on math, and the other is going to be on family engagement. And then in New Hampshire, I think they're looking at special needs and health and safety. So it can be somewhat adapted for states. So New Jersey, what did we learn? And do I have like 2 minutes left? Okay, I'll be fast. Okay, 30 institutions, you know, about half public community colleges, half four-year. I think the takeaway is to realize that there are more programs than there are institutions, so that's somewhat of interest, and very few doctoral programs, which is pretty much true everywhere. And here are really the highlights. Basically, there's almost no coursework, or not. The coursework on infants and toddlers, or the topics covered for infants and toddlers, is just way, way less than it is for preschool and K through 3. My guess is that the preschool has probably gone up a lot over the last few years, but we really haven't done much with preschool. If there is, with infants and toddlers, if there is something on infants and toddlers, it's almost always at the AA level. There's very limited work on early childhood administration and leadership, mostly the doctoral programs, and there's only 2 in New Jersey. And that the student teaching there's very little focus on student teaching for infants and toddlers, and even practicum for infants and toddlers. And so you can just, I guess this is too small to really read, but you can just eyeball it. The infants and toddlers is blue. Actually, where you get the closest is on this issue of dual language learning, because so many of the kids speak second languages. So, and then the only other thing I just want to draw your attention to is around the clinical issues, and I know other people are going to talk more about that. But one of the questions we asked was, on what basis do you choose your student teaching and your practicum sites? And I think this is really telling for what we've been talking about. It's location, 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 folks. It's not quality. You know, it's not. They're not. It's like we're going to go for where people can get to the programs, and I think that has implications if we're trying to help people learn good practice. And the other thing we asked about, who were the supervising teachers in these different, particularly in student teaching, and what people said, well, they had to be certificated teachers, but they didn't have to be trained to mentor or teach other teachers. And I think that's another issue, that there is something different about being a good teacher and then being able to be an articulate practitioner who can help someone else be a good teacher, and we really need to sort of pop that one open. And then the other thing was that only 1/4 of the programs actually did anything to adjust their clinical experiences for experienced teachers. And so when you're talking about an early childhood population going back to school, I think that has implications. And then we're still getting the faculty data back, getting faculty to respond to this. It's been really an interesting process. So we're still analyzing our faculty data. But we do know that, and this is what we've expected and we found before, in New Jersey, 59% of the faculty are over 50. 4 out of 10 said they wish they spoke Spanish, but I think about 10% do, and mostly white. So we have an issue here about who our teacher educators for. What I don't have for you is the data about what their background is in terms of teaching, but we'll have that shortly. So basically, I think, you know, we need to really realize that higher education, if we want it to be the feeder and maybe the scale one of the ways we go to scale about professional development is that we've got to do some real revamping of higher education, and we really do need to think about the infant toddler piece. And I know people say, well, people aren't necessarily teaching infants and toddlers, but for I don't know if any of you have ever taught, or I'm sure many people in this room have taught, or for me, working with infants and toddlers was the best training I ever had for working with older children, because I sort of understood how things were rolling out, and it seems like that should be an important part of it. And that the fact that we're not focusing on leadership in any way, I think, is problematic. And then the whole issue of what we're doing around the clinical experiences. On the last little piece of data, we asked people when in the course of study people had applied experiences, and almost all of the programs that had student teaching, the student teaching came in at the last year. The practicum came in maybe earlier, but which makes sense. You might start with a practicum, but people really weren't getting out into classrooms and practicing their teaching until the point at which they were almost done. And in most of the, I don't have these data, so I don't want to quote it exactly, but in most of the programs, it is just passing your student teaching and passing your courses. It says you're qualified to go out there and teach. So there's sort of a problem there that we're not really making sure people are coming out of the institutions prepared for what we think they're prepared for. Thank you.